The Marrow of Tradition, 1901, is a novel by the African-American author Charles W. Chestnut, portraying a fictional account of the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, an event that had just recently occurred.
Media accounts of the Wilmington Massacre sensationalized it as a race riot. These accounts were the only ones available to readers in the North whose knowledge was limited to what was readily available in print.
In the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, whites took over the city, ousting the elected biracial government and attacking, killing, and driving out Black citizens who comprised 55% of the population, in the only actual coup d'etat that has ever occurred in United States history.
Charles Chestnut was an African-American educator, author, essayist, political activist, and lawyer, best known for his novels and short stories exploring complex issues of racial and social identity in the post-Civil War South. Chestnut's stories on racial identity were more complex than those of many of his contemporaries. He wrote about characters dealing with difficult issues of mixed race, passing, illegitimacy, racial identities, and social place throughout his career.
These issues were especially pressing during the social volatility of Reconstruction and late 19th century Southern society.
During this time, whites in the South were trying to reestablish white supremacy in social, economic, and political spheres.
White Democrats in the South regained political dominance through paramilitary violence and suppression of Black voting.
And they passed laws imposing legal racial segregation and Jim Crow rules that forced second-class status on Black people.
Set in the fictional town of Wellington, the Marrow of Tradition features several interweaving plots that encompass the poles of racially segregated society of the American South at the turn of the 20th century. One plot follows Major Carteret, the white owner of the predominant Wellington newspaper, as he colludes with several other powerful white men to take political control of the town. They are outraged by a provocative editorial published in a Black paper that questioned white justifications for lynchings.
As the town's unrest intensifies, Carteret faces domestic pressures. His only child, Dodie, and wife, Olivia, are both unwell. Carteret's niece, Clara, recently introduced to society, is courted by the young Tom Delamere, a handsome and conniving aristocrat who spends most evenings nurturing his penchant for drink and cards.
Tom's habits are contrasted with those of Lee Ellis, a rival for Clara, and Dr. William Miller, a young Black physician educated in Paris and Vienna, who with his wife has returned to his hometown of Wellington to practice medicine. Dr. Miller's wife, Janet, is the biracial half-sister of Mrs. Olivia Carteret. Janet has always hoped to be acknowledged by her white sister, who is too proud to accept her father's miscegenation after her mother died.
Another plotline follows Josh Green, who as a boy witnessed the murder of his father at the hands of a white man, Captain McBain, and is intent on exacting revenge. All these subplots are forced to a crisis through two events: the murder of a white woman, Polly Ochiltree, for which a Black servant, Sandy Campbell, is accused, and the county elections.
Sandy would have been lynched and burned without a trial if it weren't for Dr. Miller alerting the grandfather of the actual murderer, Tom Delamere. Old Mr. Delamere and Lee Ellis discover the truth and save Sandy's life, but Tom is never apprehended for his crime.
A few months later, on the eve of the elections, Major Carteret, Captain McBain, and General Belmont conspire to incite a revolution to overthrow the Republican Party from power and keep Black citizens from participating in the elections.
The editor of the town's Black newspaper publishes an editorial decrying lynching, and Major Carteret seizes the opportunity to respond with inflammatory statements in the Morning Chronicle. sparking the white revolution that quickly becomes a massacre engulfing the town.
The novel culminates with justice for some. The faithful servant Sandy is saved by his patron. Tom Delamere falls from grace. Josh Green avenges his father's death, albeit at the cost of his own life. And Janet Miller gains recognition from her sister, who, along with Major Carteret, is humbled to respect the Black Miller family in order to save their ailing son.
In this novel, published 121 years ago, Chestnut invokes powerful themes that resonate strongly today. White supremacy, the power of the media, voting rights, interracial marriage, white womanhood and privilege, class, caste and color, healthcare, and guns.
White supremacy. In 1901, a quote from Chestnut's book is, "Gentlemen," exclaimed the captain, lifting his glass, "I propose a toast. No," and he uses the N-word, "domination." "Amen," said the others, and 3 glasses were solemnly drained. "I drink with you to white supremacy. White supremacy everywhere," added McBain with fervor. "Now and forever," concluded Carteret solemnly. So that's a representative quote from the book. And today, the resurgence of toxic white supremacy violently threatens our democratic institutions and the hallowed ideals of equality and justice under the law, in ways in which have not been seen since post-Reconstruction.
The power of the media in 1901. This is the age of crowds, and we must have the crowd with us. You, Carteret, represent the Associated Press. Through your hands pass all the news of the state. What more powerful medium for the propagation of an idea? The man who would govern a nation by writing his songs was a blathering idiot beside the fellow who can edit its news dispatches. Today, the role of media is pivotal to crafting the narrative for political and corporate special interests. The inherent danger lies in media outlets that weaponize disinformation and polarize a divided nation along lines of race, class, gender, and creed, and for corporate and political gain.
Voting rights. Here's a quote from the book. "Carteret conducted the press campaign and held out to the Republicans of the North the glittering hope that, with the elimination of the Negro vote and a proper deference to Southern feeling, a strong white Republican Party might be built up in the New South. How well the bait took is a matter of history, but the promised result is still in the future. The disenfranchisement of the Negro had merely changed the form of the same old problem. The Negro had no vote before the rebellion and few other rights, and yet the Negro question was, for a century, the pivot of American politics. It plunged the nation into a bloody war, and it will trouble the American government and the American conscience until a sustained attempt is made to settle it upon principles of justice and equity." Today, efforts at voter suppression are pervasive, and there remains resistance and intense debate over the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, legislation that would mitigate against centuries of protracted Black voter suppression.
Interracial marriage. Her father had married this woman. The marriage of a white and colored persons was forbidden by law. Only recently, she had read of a case where both the parties to such a crime, a colored man and a white woman, had been sentenced to long terms in the penitentiary. She even recalled the circumstances. The couple had been living together unlawfully. They were very low people whose private lives were beneath the public notice, but influenced by religious movement pervading the community, had sought, they said, at the trial to secure the blessing of God upon their union. The higher law, which imperiously demanded that the purity and prestige of the white race be preserved at any cost, had intervened at this point. Interracial marriage today, with the long-standing ruling of Roe versus Wade being challenged in the Supreme Court, some GOP commentators and proponents of states' rights believe that the conservative legal movement may grow emboldened to challenge the constitutionality of interracial marriage as well.
White womanhood and privilege. This event, the Chronicle suggested, had only confirmed the opinion, which had been of late growing upon the white people, that drastic efforts were necessary to protect the white women of the South against brutal, lascivious, and murderous assaults at the hands of Negro men, an inferior and degraded race above the heaven-crowned Anglo-Saxon. It would serve as a warning and an example to the vicious elements of the community of the swift and terrible punishment which would fall like the judgment of God upon anyone who laid sacrilegious hands upon white womanhood. Still today, the popular memes of the demanding white Karen and the weaponizing of white women's tears have come to symbolize the privilege and deference extended and expected by custom and white patriarchy.
Caste, class, and color. Chestnut reflecting on white classes. He was quite aware that under ordinary circumstances, the major would not have shaken hands with white working men, to say nothing of Negroes. General Belmont, the smaller of the two, was a man of good family, a lawyer by profession, and took an active part in state and local politics. Aristocratic by birth and instinct, and a former owner of slaves, his conception of the obligations and rights of his caste was nevertheless somewhat lower than that of the narrower but more sincere Carteret. Captain George McBain had sprung from the poor white class, to which even more than to the slaves, the abolition of slavery had opened the door of opportunity. No longer overshadowed by a slave-holding caste, some of this class had rapidly pushed themselves forward. For the sake of the democratic ideal, which meant so much to his race, he might have endured the affliction. He could easily imagine that people of refinement, with the power in their hands, might be tempted to strain the democratic ideal in order to avoid such contact. But personally, and apart from the mere matter of racial sympathy, these people were just as offensive to him as to the whites in the other end of the train. Surely, if a classification of passengers on trains was at all desirable, it might be made upon some more logical and considerate basis than a mere arbitrary, tactless, and by the very nature of things, brutal drawing of a color line. It was a veritable bed of Procutus. This standard which the whites had set for Negroes. In 2022, the immense income gap between CEOs and workforce employees and the legacy of disparate intergenerational wealth between Black and white Americans have changed little over decades and centuries. While physical characteristics of skin color and hair texture have been a preoccupation in the past, today's younger generation place less emphasis on assimilation and are more predisposed to Afrocentric ideas, a worldview and conception of Blackness. While in 1901, a select group of Black men and women were able to attain higher education, today educational opportunity leading to class mobility is considerably broader while still far from adequate.
And the theme of healthcare. Here's a quote. Shortly after Dr. Miller's return from Europe, he had promptly spent part of his inheritance in founding a hospital, to which was to be added a training school for nurses and in time, perhaps a medical college and a school of pharmacy. He had been strongly tempted to leave the South and seek a home for his family and a career for himself in the freer North, where race antagonism was less keen or at least less oppressive. But his people had needed him, and he had wished to help them and had sought by means of this institution to contribute to their uplifting. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed the sordid underbelly of America's inequitable healthcare systems, resulting in lack of access to medical services and a higher morbidity rate among Black and Brown Americans, including the fact that Black women are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women.
Guns. We have the guns. The Negroes are not expecting trouble and are easy to manage. Well, now, let us see. Suppose the colored people arm themselves. Messages would at once be sent to every town and county. White men from all over the state, armed to the teeth, would at the slightest word pour into town, and every railroad train and extras would be run for their benefit. The colored people became alarmed at the murmurings of the whites, which seemed to presage a coming storm. A number of them sought to arm themselves, but ascertained upon inquiring at the stores that no white merchant would sell a Negro firearms. Since all the dealers in this sort of merchandise were white men, the Negroes had to be satisfied with oiling up the old army muskets, which some of them possessed, and the few revolvers with which a small rowdy element generally managed to keep themselves supplied. The gun debate today is largely on gun safety. Is it at the fore of the American politics today? Most definitely. In recent weeks, horrific mass murders have occurred, including those at Top Supermarket in Buffalo and Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. Proponents of the Second Amendment remain recalcitrant in their stance against sensible gun control. Some observers argue that there appears to be a double standard between the Second Amendment rights as applied to Black and white owners of firearms.
And so as we come to the end of the book, for me, the essence of this book is reflected in this direct quote from its pages. How inseparably the present is woven with the past, how certainly the future will be but the outcome of the present.
And for me, the very last line of the book I found especially resonant. Doty's illness necessitated a partnership between Dr. Miller, a Black physician, and Dr. Evans, a white physician, in an attempt to save the child's life. Doty, a sick child from the beginning, was emblematic of the societal illness brought on by white supremacy and the toxic racism such a doctrine espouses. If the two men could agree to work to save the child, could it be possible that a nation divided by race could summon the will, faith, and courage to obliterate hatred and the irrational plague of white supremacy? "Come on up, Dr. Miller," called Evans from the head of the stairs. "There's time enough, but none to spare."